When Pope Leo XIV walked through the Vatican corridors that evening, he had no idea that within hours he would make a decision that would change everything, not just for himself, but for a struggling family halfway across Rome who desperately needed a miracle. The heavy golden doors of the apostolic palace closed behind him with a soft thud that seemed to echo through his very soul. Pope Leo XIV paused in the marble hallway, his white cassock rustling against the silence as he finally allowed his shoulders to sag. The weight of the papal ring on his finger felt heavier than usual, matching the exhaustion that had settled. Deep in his bones after 12 straight hours of audiences, meetings and ceremonial duties. He walked slowly through the corridors he knew by heart, past Renaissance frescoes that had witnessed centuries of papal footsteps. Tonight, their painted eyes seemed to follow him with understanding rather than judgment. The Swiss guards he passed offered their customary respectful nods, but Leo could see the concern flickering in their expressions. Even they could tell. Something was different about their Holy Father tonight. His private chapel beckoned from the end of the hallway, promising the familiar comfort of prayer and solitude. But as Leo approached the ornate doorway, his steps began to slow. The thought of kneeling before another altar, of offering another prayer in another sacred space, suddenly felt overwhelming. He'd spent the entire day being the Pope, blessing, counseling, deciding matters of faith for millions of souls around the world. His heart ached not from spiritual emptiness, but from a strange, gnawing hunger for something he couldn't quite name. When was the last time he'd simply been a man? When had he last sat across from someone who saw him not as His Holiness, but as a fellow human being struggling with the weight of existence? The Vatican walls that had once felt like protection now seemed to press inward, magnificent but suffocating. Leo stopped just outside his chapel doors, his hand resting on the cold marble doorframe. Instead of entering, he found himself turning toward the window that overlooked the city of Rome. Thousands of lights twinkled in the distance, each one representing lives being lived, families gathering around dinner tables, simple conversations happening over shared meals. For the first time in months, Pope Leo XIV felt an almost overwhelming urge to walk among those lights, to find a place where he could simply exist without ceremony or expectation. The decision forming in his mind felt both terrifying and necessary. 20 minutes later, Pope Leo XIV slipped through a side entrance of the Vatican that even most of the Swiss Guard didn't know existed. He'd traded his white cassock for simple, black trousers and a dark sweater, clothes he kept for the rarest occasions when papal duties required absolute discretion. The transformation felt both liberating and unsettling, like shedding skin he'd worn so long it had become part of him. The narrow cobblestone street welcomed him with the scent of evening cooking and the distant sound of television sets echoing. From apartment windows above, Leo pulled his collar higher and walked with measured steps, conscious that even in civilian clothes, there was something about his bearing that might give him away. Years of blessing crowds had taught him to move with a certain grace, but tonight he tried to slouch his shoulders, to make himself smaller and more ordinary. A couple walked past, arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to buy groceries. They didn't give him a second glance. The relief Leo felt was immediate and profound. When was the last time someone had looked right through him, as if he were just another person on the street? The anonymity felt like a gift he'd forgotten he missed. He turned down Via dei Cappuccini, away from the tourist routes and toward the residential neighborhoods where real Romans lived their daily lives. Here, laundry hung between buildings like colorful prayer flags, and the smell of garlic and tomatoes drifted from kitchen windows. An elderly woman in a house dress leaned from her balcony, calling down to her grandson to come upstairs for dinner. The boy, maybe 8 years old, kicked a soccer ball reluctantly toward the building entrance, his friends already dispersing into the gathering dusk. Leo paused at the scene, struck by its simple beauty. The grandmother's voice carried genuine affection, not reverence. The child responded with typical boyish resistance, not ceremonial obedience. This was life unfiltered by protocol, unscripted by centuries of tradition. As he continued walking, Leo became aware of his own breathing, how it had deepened and slowed since leaving the Vatican walls. His shoulders felt lighter, and for the first time in weeks, his mind wasn't racing ahead to tomorrow's schedule or passing through the theological implications of afternoon conversations. Instead, he found himself simply present, absorbing the rhythm of ordinary evening life around him. But as he reached a small piazza where several streets converged, Leo noticed a woman at a cafe glance at him twice, her brow furrowing with recognition. His heart quickened with familiar anxiety. Discovery always lurked, just one curious glance away. Leo quickened his pace past the cafe, heart still beating faster than he'd like, and ducked into a quieter side street where the evening shadows provided cover. He needed somewhere to collect himself, somewhere the curious glances couldn't find him. As he walked deeper into the residential maze, the tourist-facing restaurants gave way to smaller, more intimate establishments that served the locals who actually lived in this corner of Rome. That's when he saw it. A soft glow spilling from a narrow storefront squeezed between a pharmacy and a small bookshop. Delicate paper lanterns hung in the window, casting warm amber light onto the sidewalk, and wooden characters he couldn't read were painted on a simple sign above the door. The gentle illumination drew him like a moth, and as he approached, the scent of ginger and something delicately fried reached him through the evening air. Sakura read the smaller English text beneath the Japanese characters. Leo paused on the sidewalk, peering through the window at the scene inside. The restaurant was tiny, perhaps 8 tables at most, with dark wood furnishings and traditional Japanese artwork on the walls. A small family moved gracefully between the tables, a middle-aged man and woman, and what appeared to be their 2 children, a teenage boy and a younger girl. There was something profoundly peaceful about watching them work. The parents moved with synchronized efficiency, while the children helped with the kind of casual familiarity that spoke of years spent in this routine. No one was rushing or stressed. Instead, there was a quiet dignity to their service, a mindfulness that reminded Leo of certain monastic practices he'd observed in contemplative orders. The restaurant was nearly empty, just an elderly Japanese man sitting alone at a corner table, reading a newspaper while sipping tea, and a young couple sharing what looked like their first nervous date. The intimacy of the space felt both foreign and appealing. Leo had grown accustomed to grand halls and formal dining rooms where every meal was an event, every conversation weighted with significance. But this was something entirely different. Here was a place where people simply nourished themselves and each other, where the act of sharing a meal wasn't ceremony but communion in its most basic form. Leo hesitated at the threshold, one hand on the door handle. He'd never eaten Japanese food, had never ventured into a cultural space so removed from his Italian Catholic world. What if they recognized him? What if his presence disrupted their peaceful evening? What if he simply didn't belong in a place like this? The teenage boy inside looked up and caught his eye through the window, offering a small, welcoming smile. The boy's smile was the gentle push Leo needed. He opened the door and stepped inside, immediately enveloped by warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. The soft chime of a bell announced his arrival, and the aromatic blend of miso, rice, and subtle spices welcomed him like an embrace he hadn't realized he'd been craving. The teenage boy, who had smiled at him through the window, approached with a slight bow, his movements carrying the same graceful efficiency Leo had observed from outside. "Buonasera," the young man said in carefully pronounced Italian, then switched to accented English. "Welcome to Sakura. Table for one?" "Yes, please," Leo replied, struck by the boy's natural courtesy. There was no recognition in his eyes, just genuine hospitality that felt refreshingly uncomplicated. As the boy led him to a small table near the window, Leo noticed the restaurant's other occupants, the elderly Japanese gentleman still absorbed in his newspaper, and the young couple now sharing what appeared to be their first successful conversation of the evening. No one looked up with curiosity or whispered recognition. The anonymity he'd sought felt complete here, protected by cultural boundaries, and the simple fact that this family had created a space apart from Rome's usual rhythms. The boy's parents emerged from behind the counter, a woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her husband, slightly taller, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Both wore traditional black uniforms, and both stopped short when they saw Leo settling into his chair. The woman's hand went instinctively to her heart, and she whispered something in rapid Japanese to her husband. Leo caught the sharp intake of breath, the moment of recognition that he'd been dreading. But instead of the usual flustered excitement or requests for blessing, something entirely different happened. The woman bowed deeply, then approached his table with hands clasped in front of her. "Your Holiness," she said softly in heavily accented English, "we are very honored." Her husband appeared beside her, also bowing, while their teenage son's eyes widened with understanding. But there was no commotion, no drawing of attention from other diners. Instead, the family seemed to fold around Leo with protective discretion, creating a bubble of respectful privacy that surprised him completely. "Please," Leo said gently. "Tonight, I am simply a hungry man who would very much like to try your food. May I just be your guest?" The woman exchanged a glance with her husband, and something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a deeper need than simple anonymity. She smiled warmly and nodded. "Of course," she said. "Tonight, you are simply welcome. Here." Mrs. Tanaka disappeared into the kitchen and returned moments later carrying a small ceramic teapot and a delicate cup that looked like it had been crafted by hand. She set them before Leo with careful precision, her movements carrying the weight of ceremony without any of its stiffness. The pot was warm to the touch, painted with tiny cherry blossoms that seemed to dance in the restaurant's soft lighting. "Please," she said, gesturing toward the tea with both hands. "Green tea, very good for tired heart." Leo looked up at her, surprised by the phrase. In her broken English, she had somehow captured exactly what he hadn't been able to name himself. He poured the pale green liquid into the cup, breathing in its grassy, almost floral scent. The first sip was unlike anything he'd experienced, clean and earthy, with a subtle complexity that seemed to settle something restless inside him. "This is beautiful," he said softly. "Thank you." Mrs. Tanaka smiled, then pointed to herself. "Keiko," she said simply. "My name, Keiko Tanaka." She gestured toward the kitchen, where her husband was preparing something at the stove. "Husband, Hiroshi. Son, Yuki." She indicated the teenage boy, who was now carefully arranging flowers in a small vase at the next table. "Daughter, Sakura." "Sakura," Leo repeated, remembering the restaurant's name. "Like the cherry blossoms." Keiko's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Yes, you know Sakura." "I've read about them," Leo admitted. "The way they bloom so briefly but so beautifully." She nodded enthusiastically, then struggled for a moment with the English words. Finally she said, "Sakura teach us how to live. Beautiful, then gone. So we must—" She paused, searching, then made a gesture with her hands, as if holding something precious. "We must treasure." Leo felt something shift in his chest. Here was a woman whose language barriers couldn't contain the depth of what she was trying to share. Without formal education in theology or philosophy, she had just articulated something about the nature of existence that resonated more deeply than countless papal encyclicals he'd written. Yes, he said quietly. We must treasure. Keiko's eyes sparkled with connection, and she bowed slightly before returning to her work. But every few minutes she would glance over at Leo's table, not with the watchful anxiety of someone serving an important dignitary, but with the gentle attention of someone ensuring a guest felt truly cared for. As Leo sipped his tea and watched the family move through their evening routines, he realized that in this small corner of Rome, he had found something he hadn't even known he was searching for. As the evening deepened and the last customers departed, Hiroshi emerged from the kitchen carrying a plate of small, perfectly formed dumplings. He set them before Leo with a gentle bow, then pulled up a chair across the table while Keiko joined them with fresh tea. Please, Hiroshi said in English that was more confident than his wife's, though still careful. You try gyoza. Keiko make special recipe from her grandmother. Leo picked up one of the dumplings with the chopsticks Yuki had quietly provided, surprised by how natural the unfamiliar utensils felt in his hands. The dumpling was warm and savory, filled with a mixture that seemed to carry layers of flavor he couldn't identify, but somehow understood. This is extraordinary, Leo said, and meant it. How long have you been in Rome? Keiko and Hiroshi exchanged a glance, and Leo could see them calculating not just years, but struggles. Hiroshi spoke first. 7 years now. We come from Kyoto. When Yuki was small boy, he gestured toward his son, who was quietly cleaning tables nearby. Keiko's father. He have restaurant in Kyoto. Very old, very traditional, but... He paused, searching for words. Earthquake, Keiko added softly. 2011. Everything gone. We lose restaurant, lose home, Hiroshi continued. Keiko's father. He gets sick after. Heartbroken, I think. We try to stay, try to rebuild, but... He shook his head. Too much, too hard. Leo set down his chopsticks, giving them his full attention. He had counseled countless people through loss and displacement, but hearing it across this small table, over shared food and tea, felt entirely different. So we come to Italy, Keiko said. Hiroshi, he studied engineering in university, but here... She gestured around the small restaurant. Here we can only do what we know, cook, make people happy with food. It's not easy, Hiroshi admitted. Italian people, they very kind, but they don't understand Japanese food so much. And we try to keep traditions, but children, they want to be Italian. Yuki, he speak perfect Italian now, sometimes better than Japanese. Leo watched as Sakura helped her mother clear the last table, moving with unconscious grace that spoke of countless evenings spent in this routine. The girl caught him watching and smiled shyly before disappearing into the kitchen. You have built something beautiful here, Leo said quietly. Your family, this place, it carries your traditions forward while embracing something new. Keiko's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. You understand, she whispered. Not many people understand. What happened next transformed the simple restaurant into something sacred. Without any formal announcement, the entire Tanaka family began bringing dishes to Leo's table, not as a commercial transaction, but as an offering. Yuki appeared with a bowl of miso soup, its aroma rich and comforting. Sakura followed with a plate of delicately prepared sashimi, each piece arranged like a small work of art. Keiko brought tempura vegetables so light they seemed to float on the plate, while Hiroshi presented a bowl of rice that had been prepared with the kind of attention Leo usually reserved for the Eucharist. Each dish arrived with a brief explanation, the family gathering around the table to share not just food, but the stories behind each recipe. This miso, Keiko explained, my grandmother teach me. She say, soup is soul of meal, must be made. With grateful heart. Leo tasted each dish slowly, reverently, aware that he was being offered more than sustenance. This was cultural communion, a breaking of bread that transcended language and religion. The flavors were unlike anything in his Italian palate, subtle, complex, requiring attention and mindfulness that reminded him of his most contemplative prayer practices. In Japan, Hiroshi said, watching Leo's careful appreciation, we have word omotenashi, mean to serve from heart without expecting anything back. As the meal continued, Leo became increasingly aware of what was happening. This family was treating him not as a papal dignitary to be impressed, but as an honored guest to be nourished. When he reached for his wallet, Keiko's hand gently intercepted his. "No," she said firmly, but with such warmth that it couldn't be taken as anything but kindness. "Tonight, you are family guest. Family guest never pay." "But this is too much," Leo protested. "You've given me a feast." "Please, let me—" "Your Holiness," Hiroshi interrupted gently, then caught himself. "Sorry, our friend," he corrected with a smile. "You give us honor by being here, by eating our food, by listening to our stories. This is gift to us." Yuki, who had been quietly observing, spoke up in his perfect Italian. "Nonno always said that feeding someone who is far from home is the most important thing we can do." Leo felt his throat tighten. These people, who had lost everything and rebuilt their lives in a foreign country, were insisting on giving to him, a man who lived in palaces and wanted for nothing material. Yet somehow, in this moment, he felt more genuinely cared for than he had in years. "Then I accept your gift," he said softly, "with more gratitude than I can express." As the conversation flowed and the family moved around him with practiced efficiency, Leo began to notice details that spoke of struggles carefully hidden beneath their gracious hospitality. The wooden chairs, while clean and sturdy, bore the gentle scars of years of use, small nicks and worn spots that told stories of countless meals served. The tablecloth under his dishes had been mended with tiny, almost invisible stitches, the work so careful it spoke of someone who couldn't afford to replace but refused to let anything look shabby. When Keiko moved to adjust the lighting, Leo caught sight of her hands, roughened from years of kitchen work, with a small bandage around one finger that suggested long hours with sharp knives and hot surfaces. Hiroshi's apron, he noticed, had been patched at the pocket, and his shoes, while polished to respectability, showed the kind of wear that came from standing on hard floors for 10-hour days. The kitchen equipment visible through the serving window told its own story. The gas burners were older models, their flame rings slightly uneven, and the refrigerator hummed with the particular effort of machinery working harder than it should. Leo recognized the sound. It was the same determined persistence he'd heard in the Vatican's older buildings, where ancient systems continued functioning through sheer will and constant maintenance. But it was Yuki who made Leo's heart tighten with understanding. The boy wore a school uniform that had been carefully maintained, but was clearly second-hand, the blazer slightly too large, probably bought with growth in mind, and textbooks stacked on a corner shelf that showed the telltale creases and highlighting of previous owners. When Yuki bent to pick up something that had fallen, Leo glimpsed worn sneakers that had been polished to hide their age. Sakura, helping her mother in the kitchen, moved with the unconscious efficiency of a child who'd grown up understanding that every resource was precious. She turned off lights behind her automatically, rinsed dishes immediately after use, and handled everything with the careful attention of someone who knew that broken meant going without. Yet despite these quiet indicators of financial strain, there was no sense of poverty in the space, only dignity, care, and the kind of wealth that came from family bonds and shared purpose. The restaurant felt loved, maintained through effort rather than money, and somehow more beautiful for it. Leo realized he was witnessing something profound, a family that had transformed necessity into art, scarcity into mindfulness, and survival into service. They had given him their finest dishes, their warmest welcome, their most precious commodity, time and attention, without any expectation of return. The weight of their generosity settled on him like a calling. As Keiko and the children began cleaning up the evening's dishes, Hiroshi gestured for Leo to follow him toward the kitchen. "Please," he said quietly, "I show you something." They paused at the threshold, between the dining room and kitchen, where Hiroshi pointed to a small, framed photograph hanging on the wall. A much younger version of their family, standing in front of what was clearly the original restaurant in Kyoto. The building was traditional, elegant, with beautiful wooden details and a garden visible in the background. "That was my father-in-law's place," Hiroshi said, his voice carrying the weight of loss. 3 generations of family recipes. Keiko, she learned everything from her grandmother and mother there. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Sometimes I think we try too hard to recreate what we lost." Leo studied the photograph, then looked around the current restaurant. "This place has its own beauty," he said. "Different, but no less meaningful." Hiroshi nodded, but Leo could see the tension in his shoulders. "You are kind to say, but truth is, we struggle. Every month, we struggle." He glanced toward the dining room where Yuki was stacking chairs. "Yuki, he is very smart boy, top of his class. His teachers say he could study engineering like I did, maybe go to university in America, but—" The sentence hung unfinished, heavy with implications. Leo waited, sensing that Hiroshi needed to voice what was clearly weighing on him. "University costs so much money," Hiroshi continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "And restaurant. Some months we barely pay rent. I work construction during day, come here at night. Keiko, she never complain, but I see how tired she is, how her hands hurt from all the kitchen work." Leo felt something shift in his chest, the familiar stirring he'd experienced countless times when confronted with human suffering. But this felt different, more personal, more immediate. "Yuki, he never asked for anything," Hiroshi went on. "Never complain about second-hand books, about working here every evening instead of playing with friends. But I see him sometimes, looking at his classmates with their new things, their trips to university campuses." Hiroshi's voice caught. "Good father should provide for his son's dreams, no? But every euro we save, something breaks. Kitchen equipment, or roof leak, or—" He gestured helplessly, and Leo recognized the expression, the look of a man carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear alone. "You are a good father," Leo said firmly, "and Yuki knows it. I can see it in how he looks at you." Hiroshi's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I hope so," he whispered. "I hope so." Leo returned to his table, but found he couldn't sit still. The weight of what Hiroshi had shared, combined with everything he'd observed throughout the evening, had crystallized into something that demanded action. He watched as the family completed their closing routine. Keiko wiping down surfaces with meticulous care, Yuki stacking the last of the chairs, Sakura carefully arranging tomorrow's chopsticks. They had given him so much more than a meal. They had offered him refuge, understanding, and the kind of genuine human connection he'd been starving for without even knowing it. Now he understood why he'd felt compelled to leave the Vatican tonight, why his feet had carried him to this exact spot at this exact moment. "Please," Leo said, his voice carrying a new note of certainty, "would you all sit with me for a moment?" The family gathered around his table, settling into chairs, with the tired satisfaction of people who had completed another day's honest work. Leo looked at each of their faces. Hiroshi's quiet dignity, Keiko's gentle strength, Yuki's bright intelligence, Sakura's shy sweetness. "Tonight you have given me something I didn't even realize I needed," he began. "You welcomed a stranger, shared your food, your stories, your family's warmth. You have shown me what true hospitality means." Keiko started to protest modestly, but Leo held up a gentle hand. "Now I would like to give something back, not as Pope Leo XIV, but as someone whose life you have touched tonight." He paused, watching their faces. "I want to establish a fund for Yuki's education, university, wherever he chooses to study, whatever he dreams of becoming." The silence that followed was so complete that Leo could hear the hum of the old refrigerator, the distant sound of Rome's nighttime traffic. Yuki's mouth fell open. Sakura gasped softly. Hiroshi and Keiko stared at Leo as if he had spoken in a language they couldn't comprehend. "Additionally," Leo continued, his voice growing stronger, "I want to help modernize your restaurant, new equipment, whatever repairs. You need perhaps some renovation to make the work easier for your hands, Keiko." Keiko's hands flew to her face, tears spilling over her fingers. Hiroshi stood abruptly, then sat back down, clearly overwhelmed. "No," Hiroshi whispered, shaking his head. "No, this is too much. We cannot accept such—" "You can," Leo said firmly, "and you will. Because tonight you reminded me what the gospel truly means, that we are called to love one another, to share what we have, to be family to strangers." Yuki began to cry quietly, and Sakura reached for her mother's hand. An hour later, after countless tears, protestations, and eventual acceptance, Leo stood at the restaurant's entrance preparing to return to his other world. The family had insisted on packing him a small container of leftover dumplings, despite his gentle protests that he couldn't possibly accept more gifts from them. "For tomorrow," Keiko had said firmly, pressing the container into his hands. "When you remember us." As Leo reached for the door handle, Hiroshi cleared his throat softly. "Your Holiness," he said, his voice carrying a new formality that hadn't been there during dinner. "Before you go, could we ask for your blessing?" Leo paused, his hand still on the door. For hours, he had been simply a man sharing a meal with a family. Now the weight of his papal identity settled back on his shoulders, not as a burden this time, but as a responsibility that felt newly meaningful. "Of course," he said quietly, turning back to face them. The family gathered in a semicircle before him, Hiroshi and Keiko flanking their children. In the soft glow of the paper lanterns, their faces held a mixture of reverence and the warm familiarity that had developed over the evening. Leo realized this was the first time in years that he'd been asked for a blessing that felt entirely genuine, not ceremonial or obligatory, but born from real connection. He placed his hands on Yuki's shoulders, first feeling the young man's slight trembling. "May your mind be sharpened by wisdom, your heart guided by compassion, and your future bright with possibility," Leo said softly. "And may you always remember the strength that comes from family." He moved to Sakura, whose shy smile reminded him of the cherry blossoms her name represented. "May you bloom with courage and grace, little one, and may you always find beauty in the world around you." Turning to Hiroshi and Keiko, Leo felt the full weight of what they had given him tonight. "May your work be blessed, your family protected, and your hearts filled with the joy you have shared with others. You have shown me what true faith looks like, not in grand gestures, but in daily kindness." As he spoke, Leo realized he was blessing himself as much as them. This family had given him something he'd lost without knowing it. The reminder that his calling was not about position or ceremony, but about connecting with the sacred in the ordinary, the divine in the everyday. "And may we meet again," he added, "not as strangers, but as family." Keiko was crying again, but her tears were radiant. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." The walk back to the Vatican felt different than the journey out. Leo moved through the same quiet streets, but now they seemed to pulse with life rather than simply existing as a backdrop to his escape. The container of dumplings in his hands was warm against his palm, a tangible reminder that the evening had been real, not some dream born of exhaustion and longing. Each step carried him deeper into reflection. The cobblestones beneath his feet had witnessed this same journey countless times, papal figures returning from secret ventures into the city, seeking something the Vatican walls couldn't provide. But Leo sensed that few had found what he had discovered tonight, the profound truth that service meant more than ceremony, that leadership required more than authority. As he reached the familiar walls of Vatican City, Leo paused to look back, toward the neighborhood where Sakura waited in the darkness. From this distance, he couldn't see the restaurant's paper lanterns, but he could picture them glowing softly, a beacon of warmth in the Roman night. Tomorrow, his secretary would make the necessary calls, arrange the funds, set the wheels in motion to transform that family's life. But the transformation, Leo realized, had already begun, and it wasn't only theirs. The Swiss guard at the entrance nodded respectfully as Leo passed. But if they noticed anything different about their Holy Father, the lightness in his step, perhaps, or the small smile playing at the corners of his mouth, they were too well trained to comment. Leo made his way through corridors that had felt like a maze of obligation just hours before. Now they seemed to welcome him home, their marble walls no longer pressing inward but opening outward to embrace possibilities he hadn't seen before. The Renaissance frescoes that had watched him leave in exhaustion now seemed to nod with approval. Their painted saints and angels appeared less distant, more connected to the human experience he had just shared. Leo found himself wondering if this was what they had sought in their own earthly lives, not the golden halos that art had given them, but the simple grace of communion with fellow travelers. In his private study, Leo set the container of dumplings on his desk beside the stack of papal documents that would require his attention tomorrow. The contrast was stark, ancient traditions of power and ceremony beside simple food wrapped in humble packaging. Yet somehow, they no longer seemed to be in conflict. Tonight had shown him how his role could serve not just the institution of the church, but the individual hearts that sought connection, understanding, hope. He thought of Yuki, whose eyes had shone with new possibility when he'd realized his dreams of university were no longer impossible. The boy's quiet dignity reminded Leo of young seminarians he had known, filled with potential that needed only opportunity to flourish. Of Sakura, who would grow up seeing that kindness could be rewarded, that generosity created its own abundance. Of Hiroshi and Keiko, who would no longer have to choose between maintaining their dignity and providing for their children's futures. But most of all, Leo thought about the lesson they had taught him without meaning to, that grace lived not in grand gestures or ceremonial moments, but in the simple act of making space at the table for a stranger. They had seen past his titles and robes to the human being underneath, and in doing so had reminded him who he was meant to be. 6 months later, when Leo would walk past that same street on another evening stroll, he would see Sakura transformed, its facade gleaming with fresh paint, new lanterns glowing more brightly than before, and through the expanded windows, the sight of families gathered around tables where the Tanakas served their traditional dishes with the same love, but now without the weight of worry that had once burdened their shoulders. And every time he passed, Pope Leo XIV would smile, remembering the night when a simple meal had taught him that the most profound ministry happened not from pulpits or papal thrones, but around tables where strangers became family and where the sacred was found in the ordinary act of sharing what we have with those who need it most.